Tonight, begin with the horn itself, not yet a comb, and not yet promising to be one. A maker in a small town might receive cattle horn from a butcher, a drover, or a neighbor, who kept animals through winter. It came curved, dull at the surface, sometimes nicked by weather, and always individual. The first craft was judgment. A thin horn could yield a pocket comb for fine hair. A heavier one might become a dressing comb with a strong back. The worker turned it near the lamp, watching how amber, smoke, and milk-colored streaks crossed each other inside the material. Horn was valued because it could be softened with heat and pressed into a flatter sheet, yet it kept enough spring for daily use. That usefulness depended on choosing carefully. A crack near the tip warned of waste. A cloudy patch might hide weakness. The maker tapped, flexed, and scraped a small place to learn whether the horn would take a clean edge. No ruler could decide everything. Experience sat in the fingers, especially when the blank resisted slightly, but did not complain. The shop around this decision was ordinary. A bench, wedges of scrap, a pot of water, a few saws, files, and the smell of old shavings. There was no hurry in the selection, because hurry spent material. Horn was not rare in a world of cattle. But good comb, horn was never just debris. The maker imagined the curve opened, the hollow trimmed away, and the future teeth running along the strongest grain. A poor choice at dawn could follow the object for years, catching in hair or breaking in a traveler's purse. The rough end was cut away first. Then the horn was split lengthwise, often with a heated knife or a saw guided by slow pressure. Inside, the surface could be surprisingly luminous, as if the animal had kept a little sunset beneath the outer sheath. Children who watched from the doorway might see only a dark crescent becoming fragments. The craftsperson saw possible backs, handles, and tooth fields. By evening, the chosen piece lay apart from the rejects. Nothing decorative had happened. No teeth had been made. Still, an important part of the comb already existed in the refusal of flawed sections and the patient acceptance of a piece with promise. Pre-industrial work often began this quietly, in acts too small for a ledger. Looking, tapping, trimming, and deciding. The night can rest there, with the horn selected and the bench swept clear for heat. A neighbor ordering such a piece might never know how many horns had been passed over. Selection left few marks, but it protected all later labor, like choosing a quiet path before lifting a lantern. In another shop, the day's central sound is water shifting inside an iron pot. Horn that seemed stubborn yesterday is now being coaxed toward flexibility. The maker does not boil it wildly. Too much heat can raise bubbles, dull the surface, or give the material a tired, scorched smell. Instead, the pieces soak and warm until their curve becomes willing. Steam blurs the window. A small fire under the pot asks for attention without demanding conversation. This stage belonged to the old understanding that horn was neither wood nor bone. It was made of layered substance, tough like a fingernail, able to soften when warmed and harden again when cool. The craftsperson handled it with tongs, turning each piece so warmth entered evenly. A hurried apprentice might lift it too soon and find the curl still strong. Leave it too long, and the sheet could become dull or warped in a way no polish would quite forgive. Beside the pot waited simple tools, flat boards, metal plates if the shop owned them, clamps, stones for weight, and cloths darkened by use. When the horn came out, it needed to move quickly from steam to pressure. For a few minutes it behaved almost like thick leather. The maker wiped away water, checked the grain, and laid the softened piece where it could be opened. The shop filled with a warm animal scent, not dramatic, merely present, one of the remembered odors of trades that used natural materials. Flattening was not force alone. The worker persuaded the horn outward, easing the old curve, rather than breaking it. A wedge might begin the opening. Then, the piece was pressed between smooth surfaces, tightened, and left while the heat traveled out. Sometimes the maker warmed it again, and repeated the effort. A fine comb required a blank that rested flat enough for even marking. If the sheet kept a twist, the teeth later would lean and catch. This slow alteration gave horn combs part of their character. They were shaped from a body's former curve, and even after pressing they remembered that curve faintly. The maker respected the memory. Each blank cooled under weight, quiet as bread beneath a cloth. Outside, carts went by, and someone drew water from a pump. Inside, the future comb did nothing visible, yet its nature changed. When the clamps were loosened, the piece was inspected in low light. A successful blank had a soft sheen and a steady plane. It could now accept lines, cuts, and edges. The maker set aside warped scraps for smaller articles, perhaps buttons or inlay. The best sheet remained on the bench, newly calm after heat and pressure, ready for the measured geometry of teeth. A flat blank still looked plain, but it had entered the part of the work where proportion mattered. The maker chose a back, a tooth field, and sometimes a handle or a rounded shoulder. In pre-industrial shops, patterns were not always paper patterns. A well-used comb could serve as a guide. So could a strip of wood marked with notches, a pair of dividers, or the memory of sizes customers preferred for dressing hair, cleaning a beard, or tucking beneath a cap. The first lines were made gently. A point scratched the horn, leaving pale marks that caught the light when turned sideways. Wide teeth needed one rhythm. Fine teeth required another, closer and less forgiving. If both kinds were planned for a double comb, the back between them had to be strong enough to survive years of bending in hands and pockets. The maker thought about use, not just appearance. Hair thick with pomade asked for spacing different from a child's fine strands. Marking was quiet arithmetic performed by eye and touch. The worker measured a margin so the outer teeth would not be weak. Corners were rounded before they could become future breaks. A shallow curve might be traced along the back to make the comb sit comfortably in the palm. The blank was turned again and again, because horn changed color with the angle of lamplight. A line that appeared clear at noon could nearly vanish after dusk. Mistakes at this stage were delicate and stubborn. A misplaced tooth line could not be uncut. The craftsperson therefore breathed slowly and used small confirmations. Point to mark, thumb to hold, eye along the row, then another mark. In many households, such care was invisible. People noticed a comb only when it scratched or failed. Good layout hid itself inside ease. Around the bench lay the evidence of earlier attempts. Slivers trimmed from edges, cloudy pieces rejected after flattening, old combs with missing teeth kept as warnings. The maker may have listened to rain on a roof while setting out the row. There was no engine beat, only the tiny dry sound of a scribe crossing horn. By the time the pattern was complete, the object had acquired intention. It still had no separated teeth, no polished surface, no warmth from a user's hand. Yet the future had been divided into narrow spaces. The old crafts depended on such moments, where a simple material accepted a plan. When the maker put down the marking point, the blank was no longer merely a sheet. It had become a promise arranged in lines. The faint scratches also helped the maker remember the intended buyer. A large household comb, a beard comb, and a small article for a sewing basket. Each began with different distances, different margins, and different risks. The saw for comb teeth was a small, exacting tool, closer in spirit to a musical instrument than to a carpenter's heavy blade. Its curve had to be narrow, its movement steady, and its handle familiar to the hand. Once the horn blank was marked, sawing began near the open edge and moved toward the back, stopping before the spine was weakened. Each cut created a tooth beside another tooth, though at first they looked stiff and square, like a little fence. The maker held the blank against a support that allowed the blade to pass through without shaking the whole piece. Too much pressure could wander across the scratched line. Too little would polish the surface without entering it. The worker found a pace that let the saw bite softly. Fine combs required many parallel cuts, and the danger was not a single heroic mistake but fatigue, a wrist growing impatient, an eye blurring, a blade drifting by the width of a hair. Horn dust gathered along the slot. It was brushed away often, because hidden dust could make the line seem full before the cut had reached its proper depth. The smell was sharper now, warmed by friction. In a sleepy room, the repeated motion might seem simple, yet the craftsperson was making hundreds of small decisions. Is this tooth becoming too narrow? Has the blade leaned? Does the rowel still carry strength near the back? A double-sided comb doubled the care. One edge might carry broad teeth for loosening tangles, while the opposite edge held finer teeth for smoothing. The central spine needed enough substance to hold both ranks together. If the horn had a streak of weakness, the maker adjusted depth or sacrificed a few teeth rather than risk a split traveling across the whole article. There were specialized comb makers in some towns, and there were general artisans who made combs among other small goods. Either way, the sawing stage separated competent work from careless work. Even spacing gave the user a sense of quiet reliability. Uneven spacing tugged and announced the maker's inattention every morning. After the last slot was cut, the blank looked more comb-like, but not yet friendly. The tooth ends were blunt. The sides of the cuts carried burrs. A finger drawn across them would feel roughness. Still, the most anxious division had been completed. The maker could hold the piece to the lamp and see light passing through the new openings. A former sheet of horn had gained a delicate comb signature. Many slender members standing together, each one useful only because its neighbors remained properly spaced. Sometimes a maker stopped midway simply to rest the eyes. Looking away at a wall, a doorstep, or the pale square of a window could save the next line from wandering. Rest, in this trade, was another tool. After sawing, the comb entered the long patience of filing. This was the work that made teeth safe. A saw could separate them, but it left squared corners, burrs, and tiny ridges that would snag hair. The maker selected thin files, some flat, some rounded, perhaps one worn down especially for the narrowest gaps. A good file was treasured, cleaned with a card, and kept from damp as carefully as any household blade. The first task was to even the sides of each tooth. The worker drew the file through a slot, lifted it away, inspected, and returned. Rubbing back and forth carelessly could heat the horn or widen a space unevenly. The motion was restrained. Every passage removed a little material and also a little possibility, because a tooth made too thin could not be restored. The maker listened to the change in sound as rough saw marks became smoother walls. Then came the points. Sharp points were not desirable. They could scratch the scalp and break quickly. The ends were rounded with short strokes until they felt gentle against the finger pad. Some combs received slightly tapered teeth, stronger at the base and finer at the tip. That taper required judgment. It helped the comb enter hair, but if exaggerated, it made the rowel fragile. This stage shows why pre-industrial combs were intimate objects. Their success depended on contact with skin, oil, tangles, and daily habit. A maker might test the rowel on a scrap of wool, a thread, or even against the back of the hand. The question was never simply whether it looked neat. The question was whether it moved without catching. Filing produced a pale dust that settled into sleeves and along the bench edge. The shop's light revealed it whenever someone opened the door. Time seemed to narrow around the teeth. One row, one slot, one point, then the next. Outside, bells could mark an hour. Inside, the worker measured progress by roughness disappearing. Small irregularities remained, because human work carries a living variation. Yet there was a difference between slight individuality and negligence. The maker knew that difference through touch. If a tooth rasped, it returned to the file. If a corner felt proud, it was lowered. If the whole edge felt calm, the comb moved onward. By dusk, the rowel that had looked like a fence now felt like a tool meant for hair. It would still need scraping, smoothing, and polish, but the dangerous edges were gone. Filing had converted cuts into service. In that modest transformation, the comb became kinder. Apprentices learned this lesson slowly. They often wanted to finish a rowel because the rowel looked finished. The master would answer by passing one rough tooth across a thread and letting the catch explain everything. Polishing horn was partly craft and partly patience with light. The filed comb had the correct shape, yet its surface still held scratches from saw, rasp, scraper, and file. To make it pleasant in the hand, the maker worked through finer abrasives. Scrapers took down high marks. Sand, powdered stone, chalk, charcoal, leather, or cloth might be used depending on place, period, and what the shop could afford. Nothing happened all at once. The comb was rubbed along its back, across its shoulders, and carefully between teeth, where polish was hardest to achieve. The worker avoided rounding away necessary structure. A tooth could be made glossy and weak at the same time if too much substance was removed. The best finish respected the object's purpose. It shone enough to resist dirt and feel smooth, but it did not pretend to be jewelry, unless it was intended for a wealthier customer. Horn rewarded this attention beautifully. Dull brown could wake into honey, smoke, greenish black, or translucent gold. Streaks that seemed muddy in the rough blank became depth beneath the surface. A maker might pause to enjoy that change, though enjoyment did not stop the labor. Scratches showed themselves unexpectedly when the comb was turned toward a doorway. Back to the cloth it went. Some combs were warmed and wiped with oil or grease in very small amounts, not to leave them wet, but to bring out tone and help the polish settle. Too much dressing collected dust. Too little left the horn dry. The craftsperson learned moderation from ruined pieces. Natural materials often teach by punishing excess. Decoration, when present, was added with restraint in many ordinary combs. A line along the back, a few incised curves, or a shaped shoulder could distinguish the maker's work without adding weakness. More elaborate pieces might be pierced, carved, or inlaid, but common combs depended on clean finish and trustworthy teeth. Their beauty was meant to wake slowly in use. The final polishing cloth had its own history. It carried traces of earlier work, darkened at the folds, soft from years of handling. As it moved over the horn, the comb lost its dusty shop look. It began to reflect a candle in a softened line. The maker checked both faces, then the spaces, then the tooth ends again. When the polish was complete, the object no longer seemed like cut animal horn. It seemed domestic, ready for a washstand, a chest, a pocket, or a bundle of belongings tied for travel. The old workshop had turned opacity into glow. Not by magic, but by repeated gentle abrasion. A polished back also mattered because it met the owner's fingers first. Long before anyone studied the teeth closely, the hand understood whether the object had been finished generously or merely rushed towards sale. Not every comb before industrial manufacture was horn. Bone and wood carried their own virtues, and a shop that made small useful goods might turn to them when horn was scarce or when a customer wanted something cheaper, paler, lighter, or sturdier in a different way. Bone came from slaughtered animals after other uses had been claimed. Wood came from offcuts, pruned branches, cabinet scraps, or local trees seasoned long enough to behave. Bone was hard, clean-looking, and capable of taking a fine surface. It also asked for sharp tools and a careful nose for hidden flaws. The maker cut away porous sections and chose denser pieces. Unlike horn, bone would not soften obediently in hot water. It had to be sawn and filed as it was. Its dust was dry and bright, clinging to cuffs. A bone comb could feel cool at first touch, then slowly warm in the hand. Wood offered another mood. Boxwood, pear, apple, maple, and other close-grained woods could become serviceable combs if the grain ran correctly. The danger was splitting. Teeth cut across poor grain broke easily, so the maker studied lines in the wood as attentively as a boat builder reading a plank. A wooden comb might be thicker than a horn one, with fewer very fine teeth, but it could be pleasant, quiet, and inexpensive. The tools overlapped with horn work, yet the judgment changed. Bone tolerated crisp carving but punished shock. Wood welcomed the knife yet remembered moisture in the air. A damp season could swell a wooden comb. A dry hearth could shrink it. The maker accounted for such habits, leaving strength where another material might allow delicacy. Customers understood these differences in practical ways. A household might keep a plain wooden comb for everyday tidying, a bone comb for a cleaner finish, and perhaps a horn comb treasured for smoothness. Travelers liked objects that survived being wrapped in cloth among buckles, coins, and sewing things. Parents wanted teeth that would not tear a child's scalp. Barbers and wig dressers had their own preferences. In the evening, bone and wood scraps made a different landscape on the bench from horn. Bone chips were pale and angular. Wood shavings curled softly and carried the scent of the tree. The craftsperson swept them into separate piles, because each material had further uses if pieces were large enough. A history of comb making should leave room for this variety. Pre-industrial craft was not a single recipe repeated forever. It was a conversation between local supply, household need, tool skill, and the stubborn nature of matter. In bone and wood, the comb found quieter cousins to horn, each shaped by different limits. These alternatives also remind us that craft knowledge traveled sideways. A person skilled at knife handles, spoons, or small boxes already understood grain, drying, and edge behavior, so comb work could grow from neighboring trades. A finished comb still needed to leave the bench well. The maker inspected it one final time, not with ceremony, but with the caution of someone who knew how easily a small fault became a complaint. Teeth were counted by touch. The back was flexed lightly. Edges met the thumb. If the comb caught on a thread, it returned for correction. If it passed smoothly, it could be wrapped, displayed, traded, or carried to market. Selling combs before factories was often modest commerce. A town artisan might sell from the doorway, supply a barber, barter with neighbors, or send small goods with a peddler who walked from village to village. The comb did not travel alone. It might share a tray with buttons, awls, pins, buckles, thimbles, wooden spoons, or little boxes. Customers picked it up, weighed it, bent it gently if allowed, and looked for even teeth. Price depended on material, finish, size, and trust. A plain wooden comb might be bought without much thought. A polished horn comb cost more and invited closer attention. A finely cut piece, smooth enough for delicate hair, represented hours of concentrated labor. The buyer paid not only for substance, but for avoided annoyance. No scratching, no snagging, no tooth snapping during morning dressing. Care followed the comb into the household. Horn disliked excessive heat and could warp if left near a fire. Wood disliked damp neglect. Bone could chip if dropped on stone. People learned to wipe their combs, keep them away from the worst moisture, and wrap better ones for travel. A personal comb held traces of its owner's life: hair oil, powder, dust from roads, the scent of soap, the small polish of repeated handling. Some combs lasted years. Others lost teeth and became secondary tools, useful for rough work or for children until another tooth failed. Broken pieces might be saved for scraping, marking, or patching small things. In a household where material was respected, even a damaged comb did not immediately become rubbish. By following the object to market and home, the craft becomes less remote. It was not made for a museum case. It was made for mornings, illness, courtship, morning dress, travel, and ordinary attempts to appear tidy. Its maker's patience entered these moments quietly. When night settled over the shop, the bench might hold another horn blank soaking, a bone strip marked for cutting, or a wooden piece waiting for the file. Somewhere nearby, a finished comb rested in a pocket or beside a basin, already losing its newness. That was the proper end of the work. Not display, but use. The sale then did not end the story so much as distribute the maker's care into private rooms. Each quiet stroke through hair repeated, in miniature, the choices made at the bench. In a small shop, where cabinet shavings drifted underfoot, an apprentice might first be trusted with wood rather than horn or shell. Walnut was forgiving compared with brittle bone, yet it still taught seriousness. A strip cut from a furniture maker's waste pile could become a modest comb if its grain ran straight and if no hidden knot waited inside the brown surface. The master did not begin with a lecture. He handed over the blank, showed the direction of the fibers with one thumbnail stroke, and let the lesson settle through the wrist. The apprentice's work was slow marking. A line for the back, a line for the teeth, another pale scratch where the first saw cut should enter. Ink was too bold for some workers. A faint awl mark could be corrected before it turned into a permanent mistake. The young hand learned that equal spacing was not a matter of staring harder. It came from dividers, from breathing evenly, and from checking the measure at both ends, because wood could swell after a damp morning. Walnut teeth could not be forced. If the saw leaned, a tooth grew thin on one side and fat on the other. If the file jumped, the edge became ragged enough to catch wool. The apprentice tested each point on a scrap of cloth, kept for that purpose, dragging the comb gently and listening for a snag. A good tooth slid quietly. A poor one announced itself without shame. Such training made no spectacle. There was only a bench scarred by older work, a candle saved for the darkest hour, and the smell of oil used to deepen the wood's color. The master might take the comb, rub it between both palms, and return it without praise. That was not cruelty. In many workshops, a finished object had to speak for the person who made it. By evening, the apprentice understood why cheap combs were still not careless objects. A wooden comb meant for a servant's chest, a traveling bundle, or a child's hair needed the same final smoothing as a finer piece. Splinters did not respect poverty. The last duty was to soften the outer shoulders, round the back, and leave no sharp corner where a hand would rest. When the shop was swept, walnut dust gathered in dark little islands near the bench legs. The apprentice's first comb might not be sold under his name. It might be placed with other simple goods and carried to market by someone who never knew who filed it. Still, the lesson remained. Patient fingers could turn a cast-off strip into an article used every morning, and that was a quiet beginning worth remembering. Horn combs belonged to a world of heat, bargaining, and watchful eyes. A cow horn from the butcher or tanner did not look promising at first. It arrived curved, hollow, clouded with color, and smelling faintly of the animal yard. The maker saw beyond that shape. With soaking, cutting, warming, and pressure, the curved material could be opened into a plate thin enough for a pocket comb. The warming had to be mild. A plate held too near the coals blistered, darkened, or took on a sour odor that no polishing could hide. Many workshops used hot water, warmed boards, or a cloth between horn and iron so the material softened without being scorched. Once pliant, it was pressed flat, underweight, and left to cool. The result was never perfectly obedient. Horn remembered its curve, and the maker worked with that memory instead of pretending it had vanished. Market combs were judged quickly. A buyer might bend one end, hold it toward the doorway, or look for cloudy patches where the material had grown thin. Some wanted pale amber horn because it seemed cleaner. Others preferred darker, streaked pieces because stains and age would show less. A maker who sold at a stall needed honest hands as much as skilled ones, for a flawed comb could return with an angry customer. After the teeth were sawn, fine ash and soft rag helped bring up the surface. Ash was humble, but it could polish gently when mixed with patience. The worker rubbed until the horn lost its dullness and began to catch a low glow, like weak tea held against light. No two combs matched, because every horn carried its own bands, shadows, and cloudy places. That irregularity was part of their beauty. Suspicion followed the trade. Thin horn could be passed off as a better grade. A cracked back might be warmed and pressed until the break hid for a day. Street customers learned to flex a comb lightly and inspect the base of the teeth, where weakness liked to begin. The honest maker welcomed such tests, though perhaps with tired eyes, because trust was a tool in business too. At closing time, unsold horn combs were wrapped against damp and packed away from mice, grease, and careless elbows. The smell of warmed horn lingered in the stall cloth. Tomorrow the maker would unfold the bundle again, set the combs in rows, and hope that practical people could see the labor hidden inside those small translucent arcs. A patient stall holder also noticed weather. Frost made horn less forgiving. Summer softened packed goods, and rain invited swelling in wooden boxes. So the morning arrangement was practical as well as pretty. Darker sturdy pieces near busy hands, finer translucent ones, just far enough back to escape careless bending. Bone comb making began long before the saw touched the blank. The raw material had to be cleaned, split, boiled, scraped, and dried until it became something fit for the hand rather than the midden. Leg bones from cattle offered denser walls, though even the best pieces held pores and subtle changes in color. A maker studied them carefully, turning each strip near the hearth to see where the strongest section lay. Unlike horn, bone did not soften into new shapes with friendly heat. It accepted cutting, filing, and polishing, but it punished haste. A hard push could chip a tooth before it was born. A careless blow might send a hairline crack through an afternoon's work. The person at the bench learned to remove little by little, letting the tool do its thin work instead of trying to win by force. The first shaping produced a dry powder that settled on sleeves and made the room smell faintly mineral, almost like old chalk mixed with soup bones. Workers often kept a damp rag nearby, partly to control dust and partly to wipe the blank clean enough for inspection. Candlelight could flatter bone, hiding scratches until daylight revealed them. For that reason, final finishing was best done slowly, with the piece turned again and again. Bone combs had a social place of their own. They were stronger than many wooden combs, less costly than shell, and less likely than horn to bend in a pocket. They might be made for soldiers, peddlers, schoolboys, or households where an object needed to last without looking grand. A plain bone comb could live in a sewing box for decades, its teeth yellowing with use while the back grew smooth from fingers. The maker paid special attention to the valley between teeth. If two cuts met roughly, dirt and oil would gather there. A narrow file, sometimes no wider than a pinched sliver of metal, cleaned the spaces one by one. Then came scraping with a blade held nearly upright, followed by finer rubbing with sand, chalk, or leather. By the hearth, the finished comb looked quiet rather than luxurious. Its value rested in exactness. Teeth that did not wound the scalp, a back that would not snap, edges rounded enough for everyday use. Bone kept traces of its origin, but craft altered its meaning. What had once carried an animal through a field could, with washing and skill, become a domestic companion tucked beside a mirror or carried in a coat. In some places, scraps too narrow for full combs were kept for practice. A novice could learn the sound of a safe stroke on those remnants, hearing the difference between a clean rasp and the small click that warned of chipping. Waste became instruction before it became sweepings. Tortoiseshell was never an ordinary workshop material. It came through trade, cost more than local bone or horn, and carried the uneasy glamour of distance. A small sheet might arrive wrapped and guarded, mottled with honey, smoke, and dark islands. The comb maker who received it understood at once that waste would be expensive. Even a narrow shaving mattered. Shell asked for heat, but only the careful kind. Warmed too fiercely, it clouded or warped. Pressed too impatiently, it split along a hidden weakness. Artisans learned to soften sections gradually, sometimes between warmed plates, sometimes over steam, always watching for the moment when the material could be persuaded without being injured. Its beauty tempted the eye, yet its temper kept the hands humble. Fine dress combs made from shell often rose above the head rather than hiding inside a pocket. They could hold hair in place, display status, or catch candlelight during an evening gathering. The teeth had to be strong enough for use and graceful enough for display. A clumsy outline wasted the material's natural pattern. A thin tooth broke and turned luxury into embarrassment. Design began by studying the sheet itself. Dark markings might be placed along the crown of the comb, while clearer amber sections could fall through the teeth. The maker traced curves that suited the material, instead of forcing symmetry on every patch. Pierced decoration, when used, demanded tiny drills, fine saws, and remarkable restraint. One slip could open a scar across the most visible part. Polishing shell was a long conversation between surface and light. Scratches disappeared only after repeated, rubbing with gentle abrasives and soft cloth. The final glow did not look painted on. It seemed to rise from within the sheet. People prized that depth, and imitations tried to borrow it, but the trained eye noticed false uniformity. Real shell held irregular weather, as though dusk and gold had settled together. There was also moral distance, though earlier buyers did not always name it. The material came from living creatures in far waters, carried through chains of commerce that hid labor and loss. In the pre-industrial shop, the maker saw only the costly plate on the bench, yet the object already contained a wider world. When a shell comb was complete, it was wrapped more carefully than common wares. It might enter a dowry chest, a fashionable dressing table, or a merchant's locked drawer. Its making joined risk with splendor. Warmth, pressure, cutting, and polish held just short of ruin. Customers who commissioned such pieces often cared about silhouette as much as material. A high crest changed the line of a hairstyle. A shallow curved comb hid more discreetly. The maker therefore balanced fashion with physics, knowing that elegance unsupported by strength would soon become fragments in a drawer. Not every comb left the maker through a tidy shop door. Many traveled in a peddler's tray, wrapped in cloth and carried along lanes, river roads, and market streets. The tray might hold needles, ribbons, thimbles, cheap knives, buttons, pins, and a row of combs sorted by price. Some were wood, some horn, some bone, and perhaps one or two finer pieces kept aside for a customer with coins to spare. The peddler became a moving display case and a traveling judge of workmanship. He learned which combs snapped in cold weather, which backs warped near a damp wall, and which makers supplied goods that could survive a week's jostling. If a village woman complained that a tooth had torn her hair, the peddler remembered. If a farm servant bought the same style again after losing the first, he remembered that too. For the maker, this route required different thinking from custom work. A comb destined for a known client could answer one set of habits and wishes. A comb placed in a traveling tray needed broader virtues. It had to look decent at a glance, feel smooth when handled, and endure storage among metal goods that could scratch it. The price had to leave a margin for the seller, the maker, and sometimes the wholesaler standing between them. Small variations mattered. A wide-toothed comb suited wet hair or coarse curls. A fine-toothed one helped with grooming, dust, or lice, though the closest teeth demanded more labor and broke more easily. Children might be given sturdy wooden pieces. Adults who wanted respectability without extravagance chose polished horn or bone. The peddler's call brought the comb into kitchens and doorways rather than formal shops. A buyer could hold it near the light, run a thumb across the points, and ask whether it would last. There might be talk of a neighbor's cracked comb, of a daughter going into service, of a son leaving with a bundle. The object was small, but the purchase belonged to the rhythms of family life. At night, the peddler repacked the tray by touch, placing fragile goods where they would not grind against buckles or blades. Dust from the road found every seam of the cloth. Somewhere behind each comb lay a bench, a file, and a maker's eyesight spent on narrow spaces. The traveler carried that hidden labor from house to house, turning workshop patience into household necessity. The tray also carried news of taste. If red ribbons sold beside pale bone combs in one district, the peddler might ask for more of that pairing next month. Through such small reports, remote benches learned what distant households were willing to buy. Broken comb did not always go straight to the fire or rubbish heap. In households where money was counted carefully, a damaged object invited repair, trimming, or a new purpose. A missing tooth near the end could be smoothed away. A cracked back might be bound for a while with thread, wire, or a strip of linen stiffened with glue. The repair seldom restored beauty, but it could return usefulness. Makers sometimes saw old combs brought back to the bench. The owner might ask for rough teeth to be eased, a sharp corner to be rounded, or a split to be shortened into a smaller comb for a child. This work paid less than making a new piece, yet it revealed how deeply ordinary goods entered daily life. People did not mend what meant nothing to them. Different materials failed in different manners. Wood swelled, shrank, and split along grain. Horn bent, peeled, or cracked, where heat had once persuaded it flat. Bone chipped sharply, and could lose teeth at their roots. Shell, beautiful and costly, might fracture with a heartbreakingly clean line. The repairer had to understand not only the break, but the nature behind it. There were limits. A comb fouled beyond cleaning, crawling with pests, or split through its main strength, could not honestly be promised a future. Still, even then, pieces might be saved. A smooth back from a ruined comb could become a small scraper. A section of horn might patch another object. Bone fragments could be shaped into tags, counters, or inlay. Pre-industrial workshops often treated material as something with remaining chances. Repair also changed the appearance of possession. A mended comb carried evidence of care. Darkened edges, a polished thumb place, a shortened row of teeth that no longer matched its original plan. Such marks made the object less suitable for display, but more intimate. It belonged to one person's hand, one drawer, one history of use. The craftsperson performing repair needed patience of a different sort from the pride of new making. There was no clean blank, no ideal outline, no full freedom of design. The task was negotiation with damage. File only enough. Heat only if safe. Bind without creating a new snag. Stop before helpfulness became harm. When the repaired comb returned home, it carried a modest reprieve. Perhaps it would serve one more season, or only until fair day brought a replacement. Either way, repair reminds us that handmade goods lived in time. They aged, suffered, were adjusted, and sometimes found a second life after their first shape failed. Children noticed these altered objects closely. A shortened comb might be easier for a small hand to manage, and a patched back could become familiar rather than shameful. Repair taught the young that value did not always vanish with a break. Sometimes it changed shape and continued quietly. Among the least glamorous combs were some of the most necessary. Fine-toothed combs used against lice demanded close spacing, firm material, and patient finishing. They were not ornaments for a dressing table, but tools of household health. In crowded rooms, schools, ships, barracks, and poor lodgings, such combs could matter as much as soap, linen, and boiling water. Making one was difficult because the teeth stood near together. Each cut removed only a sliver, and each sliver had to leave enough strength on both sides. If the teeth were too thick, they missed what they were meant to catch. If they were too thin, they snapped or bent. The maker worked under good light when possible, clearing dust often so the route could be inspected without illusion. Bone was a common choice for close teeth, though hard, fine-grained wood and horn also appeared. The material needed a smooth surface because roughness pulled hair and discouraged use. A person already enduring itching and embarrassment did not need a tool that scratched the scalp raw. The final rounding of the points was therefore not a luxury. It was mercy expressed through craft. Cleanliness, in earlier centuries, was a practical, social, and moral subject, all at once. A family might own a special comb kept apart from decorative pieces. Mothers, servants, nurses, or older siblings could sit a child near the window and work slowly through the hair. The comb was wiped again and again. Nits caught between teeth had to be removed. The scene was ordinary, uncomfortable, and deeply human. Because these combs worked hard, they wore out. Fine teeth broke, especially when used on tangled hair. Some households wrapped them in cloth after washing. Others tossed them into a drawer where the delicate row struck scissors and keys. Makers knew the fate of such tools, and often built them with a thicker back for grip and strength. There was no romance in the labor, yet it deserves attention. Pre-industrial comb making was not only about vanity, trade, or elegant materials. It also served the body's less polite needs. A close-toothed comb helped people manage discomfort, maintain dignity, and reduce infestation in a world without modern treatments. At the bench, the maker could measure this purpose in narrow gaps. Tooth after tooth had to be even, smooth, and resilient. The finished object might never be admired, but it would be used with concentration. Its quiet success was simple: fewer pests, calmer sleep, and a cleaner head resting on the pillow. After use, cleaning the comb was part of the work. Hot water could help some materials and harm others, so households relied on wiping, picking, and drying near warmth, rather than in fierce heat. Neglect left residue at the roots of the teeth, exactly where the tool needed to stay clear. The final polish could take longer than a stranger expected. By then the comb had already survived tutting, shaping, spacing, filing, and correction. Its outline was decided. Its teeth stood in order. Yet the difference between acceptable and pleasing still lay in the surface, where every scratch waited to catch light or skin. Polishing was not one action, but a sequence of gentler contacts. Coarse marks came away first, with fine file work or scraping. Then sand, chalk, ash, rotten stone, leather, linen, or a worn rag might follow, depending on material and local habit. Horn wanted a different touch from bone. Wood could be enriched with oil or wax. Shell required exceptional caution, because heat from over-rubbing might undo earlier care. The maker's fingers served as inspectors. They moved along the back, over the shoulders, down the teeth, and into the spaces where dust liked to hide. Sight alone was unreliable in a dim room. Touch found burrs that the eye missed. A comb meant to pass through hair had to be judged almost as hair would judge it, by catching or not catching. Some workshops kept rejected pieces nearby as warnings. One had a broken tooth from filing too boldly. Another showed cloudy horn where warming had gone wrong. A third carried a permanent gouge across the back, proof that a hurried final hour could ruin steady, earlier work. These failures taught without speaking. They asked the worker to slow down when the mind was already imagining payment. Before sale, the comb might be wiped clean, wrapped, paired with similar goods, or placed in a drawer until market day. If it was custom made, the buyer's name or order might be remembered by a chalk mark, a paper scrap, or simply by the maker's habit. There were no barcodes, no sealed packets, no promise of identical replacement. The object carried its own evidence. A calm pride belonged to this stage. Not boasting, not theatrical perfection, but the satisfaction of removing one last roughness. The craftsperson knew that the purchaser would rarely think about the finishing. People notice a comb most when it fails, when it scratches, breaks, tears, or stains the hand. Good polishing disappears into comfort. So the last minutes at the bench were an act of quiet prevention. The maker softened the end teeth, cleaned the grooves, rubbed the back until it rested easily against the palm, and set the comb down only when it felt ready for another life. From that point forward it belonged less to the workshop than to mornings. Travel bags, bedside boxes, and hair loosened at the close of day. That readiness was humble, precise, and easily overlooked. Craft did not end when the polishing rag was folded away. A maker needed to imagine the journey. Jolting bridges, rain under a cart tilt, curious fingers at an inn table, and the hard knock of one bundle against another. Leader combs for dressing hair are often tied in pairs, flat faces together, with a strip of straw between them. Fine-toothed lice combs were safer in little sleeves of scrap leather. If a tooth snapped before sale, the loss belonged to the maker, so packaging was another quiet part of skill. Market day began before dawn. The trader might arrange pins, ribbons, needles, and combs on a board, while the town was still smelling of wet hay and chimney smoke. Customers did not ask for romance. They asked whether the teeth were even, whether the back bent too much, whether a child would catch hair on the corner. A servant buying with saved coins might test the edge against her thumb. A farmer's wife might choose the plainer one, because it would last longer in a wooden chest. Prices shifted with weather and distance. If roads were flooded, horn from one district arrived late and cost more. If cattle had been slaughtered after autumn grazing, bone blanks could be plentiful for a while. The maker at home heard about these changes slowly, through gossip, returned bundles, and the trader's careful complaints. A comb was a domestic object, yet it belonged to roots mapped by hooves, ferries, toll bars, and muddy lanes. At night, after the market closed, unsold pieces came back wrapped in the same cloth with new scratches from handling. The maker examined them by lamplight. A corner might need smoothing again. A pale streak might need more oil. A fine tooth might lean after a careless trial. Nothing about this trade was grand, but it was attentive. The comb's usefulness depended on the bench, the road, and the ordinary patience of people who carried small things safely through a large, dark countryside. A seller who knew his route also knew local hair habits. Fishing villages asked for strong teeth that survived salt air. Inland towns wanted smaller pieces for caps and Sunday grooming. The maker listened to these reports and altered the next bundle, changing thickness or finish without announcing innovation. Rules might name the length of apprenticeship, the fees owed on entry, the right to keep certain tools, or the quality expected from goods offered in public. The point was partly protection and partly pride. Poor work could injure buyers, but it could also undercut neighbors who had spent years learning how horns softened, how bone split, and how shell punished haste. The better masters knew that inspection was not only interference. It was a reminder that a craft lived among other households. The apprentice in such a shop learned slowly. At first there were floors to sweep, water to fetch, horn shavings to gather before they drifted into food, and errands to the tanner, butcher, or turner. Later came rough filing, then tooth spacing, then the guarded privilege of finishing an edge someone would feel against the scalp. A master might ruin a boy's early practice pieces in front of him, not cruelly, but with firm economy. Here the line wandered. Here the gullet was too deep. Here the back had been thinned until it lost strength. Marks and labels varied. Some makers scratched initials in a hidden place. Others relied on a shop sign, a stall position, or the memory of regular customers. Written bills became more useful where trade widened. Yet many transactions still rested on recognition. The woman who bought a wedding comb for her sister might return years later for a child's smaller one, expecting the same calm finish. Taxes and tolls entered the story without drama. A bundle crossing a town gate might owe a fee. A fare could require payment for space. Imported shell might carry charges before it ever reached the bench. These costs did not sing in the workshop, but they shaped which materials appeared there. When the shutters were closed, the rules remained in the room like cooled iron. They could be burdensome, certainly. They could also preserve a standard in a world without factory gauges. The comb maker's freedom was never absolute. It was the narrower freedom of doing careful work within promises made to masters, buyers, neighbors, and the town itself. Even disputes could teach the shop. If a buyer complained that a tooth line scratched, the master compared the returned comb with work still on the shelf. A single fault might become tomorrow's lesson for everyone at the bench, more persuasive than any written rule. A flattened horn plate might begin as a curved piece cut from cattle horn, soaked and warmed until it could be pressed between boards. The pressure had to be steady. Stones, clamps, wedges, and simple screws all served in different shops, each leaving the maker to judge when the piece had accepted its new form. In cold weather, the plate stiffened quickly, so movements were prepared before the horn came near the heat. Tools were laid out, cloths dampened, weights cleared of ash. The winter bench encouraged listening. A faint tick could mean the material was cooling unevenly. A sweet, singed scent warned that the surface had been kept too close to coals. When horn was right, the saw entered with less chatter, and the file raised shavings that curled rather than dusted away. The maker did not hurry this state. It lasted only a little while, but haste wasted it. Light was another problem. Short days forced work toward the window, then toward candle and rushlight. Tooth spacing by poor light invited errors, so the most demanding cuts were saved for the clearest hours. Rough shaping could continue later, along with rubbing, sorting, and small repairs. Family sharing the same room learned the sounds. Scrape, pause, breath, scrape again. The craft occupied winter evenings without needing much speech. Horn also carried memory of the animal. No two plates behaved alike. One section might contain a cloudy streak that resisted polish. Another might reveal worn amber bands after oiling. A maker who understood this did not fight every variation. Some combs were left plain and strong. Others were given a softly rounded back to show the grain-like translucence beneath the surface. By the time snow gathered against the threshold, several finished pieces might lie under a cloth, cooling into their final shapes. They were humble things, meant for hair, beard, cradle, and chest. Yet each held a record of controlled heat, not the blast of industry, but the patient nearness of hand, fire, water, and judgment. Children were warned away from the warming boards, not because the work was mysterious, but because one careless bump could bend an afternoon out of shape. In a crowded household, craft discipline included making space around heat and teaching others when silence was useful. The first labor was unpleasant, but necessary. Scraping, boiling, drying, and sometimes burying were used to make bone workable, depending on place and habit. A maker wanted material that no longer smelled strongly when warmed by the hand. After cleaning, the bone was sawn into strips, avoiding porous centers and weak places. Waste was expected. A piece that looked generous from the outside might reveal hollows, cracks, or dark veins once opened. Bone rewarded a different touch from horn. It did not soften kindly over heat. It chipped if bullied and powdered under the file with a dry pale residue that settled on sleeves and lashes. The teeth needed careful support while they were being cut, because a narrow point could break away near the end of a stroke. Many makers left the teeth slightly heavier at first, then refined them after the whole row had been formed. The appeal of bone was its steadiness. It could be made smooth, clean-looking, and modestly bright without pretending to luxury. For households that wanted durable tools rather than ornament, bone combs made sense. They were suitable for men who kept beards, for women who pinned hair under caps, and for children whose things were always being dropped. A plain bone comb in a drawer might serve for years, acquiring small darkened places where fingers held it most often. There was also a moral economy around leftovers. Nothing from an animal was casually wasted in a poor or middling household. Horn might become a spoon, hoof might go to glue, hide to leather, fat to candles, bone to buttons, handles, dice, or combs. The comb maker belonged to that chain of uses. Skill turned remnants into daily order. In the evening, bone pieces looked almost luminous beside darker horn. The maker checked each one by touch, because sight alone could miss a sharp ridge. A final rub with fine abrasive and cloth made the teeth gentle enough for skin. From refuse came an object of cleanliness, and that quiet transformation was one of the craft's oldest satisfactions. Some customers preferred bone because its plainness seemed honest. It did not announce wealth or fashion. It simply promised order. In inventories, such combs could be listed beside scissors, thread, and linens, part of the small equipment by which a household kept itself presentable. Choice of wood mattered from the first cut. Boxwood was prized where available, because it was close-grained and could take fine detail. Fruitwoods offered pleasant color and a smooth finish if seasoned well. Birch, beech, and other local woods served for sturdier, wider teeth. Greenwood was a trap. It might look obedient under the blade, then shrink, twist, or split after the work was done. Seasoning required storage, patience, and the ability to imagine future movement inside a quiet board. A wooden comb began with reading grain. Teeth set across troublesome lines would snap. A back cut too thin might warp near the hearth. The maker marked the outline with a scribe or knife point, then removed waste little by little. Sawing the spaces demanded restraint because wood could invite speed. The file corrected what the saw began, and a sliver of abrasive leaf or fine sand smoothed the hollows. These combs often lived close to outdoor work. A herdsman might use one for beard and hair after sleeping in a barn. A mother might keep a wide wooden comb for loosening a child's tangles before the finer comb appeared. In some regions, decorated wooden combs carried chip carving, punch dots, or simple incised borders. Ornament did not need gold to matter. A row of small cuts along the back could make a tool recognizable in a crowded household. Oil and handling deepened the surface over time. Pale wood became honey-colored. Corners softened. The teeth took on a polish from use that no workshop could fully imitate. If one broke, the owner might keep the comb anyway, because a missing tooth did not always end its service. Many useful objects in pre-industrial homes survived in this patched, tolerated state. The wooden comb reminds us that craft history is not only about rare materials. It is also about nearby trees, dry rafters, winter whittling, and the maker's respect for grain. In a world of limited possessions, a light comb shaped from a seasoned scrap could carry as much daily value as a more expensive thing brought from far away. Tool marks on surviving wooden combs can be especially tender to notice. They show where a blade hesitated near a knot, or where filing continued after the main shape was already clear. The maker's judgment remains visible, because wood records pressure with unusual candor. Shell responded to heat, but not in the same forgiving manner as horn. It could be joined, flattened, and shaped by skilled hands, yet it punished dirt, overheating, and clumsy pressure. The maker kept surfaces clean, warmed pieces cautiously, and watched for the moment when stiffness gave way. Pressing too soon could crack it. Waiting too long allowed it to cool and resist. The work required confidence without swagger. Big shell was beautiful. It tempted overworking. A plain curve might show the material better than heavy carving. Light passing through a thin edge revealed clouds and amber windows that no paint could copy. Wealthier customers might want high dressing combs, side combs, or ornaments meant to be seen above arranged hair. Even then, comfort mattered. The teeth had to enter hair smoothly, and the headpiece could not snag ribbons or veils. Trade left traces on the bench. A maker might hear names of ports without ever seeing the sea. Lisbon, Amsterdam, London, Marseille, or smaller harbors, known through invoices and rumor. Shell could pass through many hands before reaching a provincial workshop. Dotting, its price rose and fell with ships, wars, fashion, and availability. Thus a delicate comb carried global distance into a quiet room lit by one window. Scraps were guarded. Small pieces could become inlays, repairs, buttons, or narrow ornaments. Dust and filings were not treated carelessly, for they represented value even when nearly useless. Apprentices were not given shell until they had proved themselves on humbler substances. The master might demonstrate a single operation and say very little, expecting the watching eyes to learn from pace, not lecture. At day's end, a shell comb placed near a candle seemed almost alive with buried light. It belonged to luxury, certainly, but also to discipline. Its beauty came from restraint, enough heat, enough pressure, enough polishing, and then the wisdom to stop before the material lost the quiet depth that made it worth working at all. Fashion plates and court portraits could make shell seem effortless, as though such combs had simply bloomed in dressed hair. The bench told another truth. Behind the graceful outline stood trade credit, guarded heat, spoiled experiments, and the long apprenticeship required to touch an expensive plate calmly and steadily. Customers brought injuries of many kinds. A bone comb might have lost 2 teeth after being stepped on near a bed. A horn comb could warp after lying too close to the hearth. A wooden one might split where grain had been misread years earlier. Shell ornaments arrived with cracked crests, missing points, or old repairs yellowed by time. The maker first decided whether the piece deserved labor. Some damage could be made safe but not handsome. Some could be hidden only by removing too much strength. The repair bench used familiar tools in a different mood. Instead of bringing a new form into being, the worker negotiated with someone else's history. Grease from fingers, old polish, household smoke, and the memory of former shaping all changed how the material behaved. Cleaning came first, then gentle filing, then a decision about symmetry. A comb, shortened at one end, might need the other end altered so the loss looked intentional. For valuable shell, patching could be delicate. Heat might allow a small piece to be joined, but the colors seldom matched perfectly. Horn could sometimes be pressed flatter again if the warp was not severe. Bone gave fewer second chances. Once broken, it often demanded smoothing rather than true restoration. Wooden combs could be trimmed, pegged, or simply made less sharp around the wound. Repair also reveals household habits. People kept combs in pockets, boxes, caps, and bedding. They lent them, dropped them, washed them poorly, and sometimes treasured them beyond their price. A comb used by a parent might remain in a drawer after death, too ordinary to call an heirloom yet too intimate to throw away quickly. When such an object came to the maker, the request might be practical, emotional, or both. The repaired comb carried visible time. It might never look new, and that was acceptable. Pre-industrial life contained many such objects, serviceable, altered, bearing small compromises. The comb maker's skill was not only in perfect rows of fresh teeth, it was also in knowing how to make a damaged edge gentle again, so an old tool could pass once more through hair without complaint. There was humility in accepting a repair job. New work allowed pride, mending required service. The maker had to preserve as much as possible while changing enough to matter. That balance suited an age in which replacement was never as effortless as modern habit imagines. At the end of a working day, the maker put away more than tools. Saws were brushed clean, so grit would not dull them overnight. Files were laid where damp would do least harm. Bowls of cloudy water were emptied outside. Horn scraps, bone offcuts, shell fragments, and wood shavings were sorted according to possible use. A poor shop wasted almost nothing, but it also could not keep every speck. Judgment included knowing what to save. The ledger, if there was one, told a plain story. A comb sold on credit, a repair paid in eggs, a bundle sent with a carrier, a fee owed at the next fair. Many makers lived close to uncertainty. Illness in the household slowed production. Bad weather delayed supplies. A new fashion could make one shape desirable, and another suddenly old-fashioned. The bench was steady, but the world around it never stood still. Industrial methods would eventually bring cheaper combs in larger numbers, with more regular shapes and less dependence on a single worker's eye. That change did not make earlier craft foolish. It reminds us what regularity cost and what it replaced. The old combs held minute differences. A slightly warmer curve, teeth spaced by practiced sight, a back polished longer, because the maker felt a stubborn scratch under the thumb. Such differences were not defects in their own setting. They were evidence of human scale. A calm history of comb making is therefore a history of touch. It includes animals, trees, seas, markets, apprentices, toll collectors, household drawers, and the soft resistance of hair. It includes fatigue too. Sore wrists, dusty cuffs, weak winter light, and the worry of spoiling a costly blank. The finished object was small enough to disappear into daily routine, which is why it deserves attention. When the lamp was pinched out, a few combs might remain on the bench, pale or dark in the remaining glow from the hearth. Tomorrow, they would be wrapped, sold, repaired, criticized, or used. For now they rested in silence, each one a modest record of making before machines took over the ordinary morning work of teeth, backs, edges, and polish. So the final image is not a museum case, but a room cooling after labor. The tools wait without ceremony. The materials keep their separate smells. Somewhere nearby, a person runs yesterday's comb through loosened hair, trusting a small object whose maker may never be named.